Can you imagine it, right at the family dinner table, my younger sister leaned back in her chair, smiling lightly as if she were talking about a weekend getaway, and then announced that next week she would be moving into my house. No asking, no discussion, just a simple statement as if it had already been decided. And the worst part was that every pair of eyes around the table agreed, as if this plan had been carefully prepared long before, and I was the only one left out. In that moment, I realized it all, from the set of dishes my mother only brought out for Thanksgiving, to the champagne bottle just popped open. None of it was for an ordinary dinner, but to celebrate a decision that had been arranged behind my back. Welcome to Family Ashes, where family secrets burn to ashes, where wounds you thought had healed can bleed again with the slightest touch, and where the truth, once spoken, always leaves scars. If one day, the house you had saved for 10 years, through cheap dinners, postponed vacations, sleepless nights from extra shifts, suddenly was treated as a gift reserved for someone else, what would you do? Would you stay silent and let everything unfold as usual, or would you stand up and accept becoming the villain in your family's eyes? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like and share this video, so together we can protect our boundaries, reclaim our voices, and know that no one has to endure this alone. I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas. The city is vast, with cars flowing endlessly along the highways, glass buildings glowing as the sun goes down, and suburban houses lined up neatly as if cut from the same blueprint. In the middle of all that noise, I chose a quiet life, keeping my world contained in my work and in the small house I had spent nearly a decade scraping together enough money to buy. I am Claire Mitchell, 37 years old, chief accountant at a construction company. No husband, no children, no one to split the monthly bills with, just me and the numbers. But those numbers sustained me, gave me the strength to stand, gave me a roof I could call my own. That house was not just property, it was proof of all the years I said no to fancy dinners with colleagues, gave up trips with friends, lived frugally to the point of near deprivation. Every time I walked through that door, I felt more pride than exhaustion. That day, I went to my parents' house for dinner as usual. Since childhood, family meals had been considered the glue that bound us, but as I grew older, I saw them more as a stage where everyone played the roles assigned to them. I stepped into the dining room and instantly sensed something was off. The table was covered with a crisp white cloth, not a wrinkle in sight. My mother had laid out the gold-rimmed china, the kind that only appeared on Thanksgiving or Christmas. At the center of the table were crystal glasses sparkling under the chandelier light, too elegant, too unfamiliar. A champagne bottle sat chilling in an ice bucket, beads of condensation sliding down its sides, as if the whole room were waiting for some grand toast. I froze for a few seconds, my heart beating faster than usual. Our family dinners were always simple, my mother's roast chicken, a few plates of vegetables. We rarely made a fuss, and certainly never chilled champagne for a Sunday night. Looking at the scene in front of me, I knew one thing for certain, this was not just dinner. This was a reveal, one I had not been told about. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave right then, but my feet felt nailed to the floor. I sat down in my usual chair, a heavy sense of foreboding swelling in my chest, that this unusual display of grandeur was not meant to welcome me, but to prepare for something that would cost me far more than a quiet evening. Sophie sat across from me, looking relaxed, as if everything had already been decided and she only had to announce it. She tucked her blonde hair behind her ear, leaned back, and spoke in a light, almost cheerful voice, "Next week I'll move into your house, until I get settled." Just one short sentence, but it rang in my ears like a verdict already signed. Not a request, not a discussion, but a firm declaration, as if the house I had poured 9 years of my youth into was nothing more than a temporary stopover for a sister who failed over and over yet was always rescued. I remembered how many times Sophie quit jobs after only a few months, how many times she cried until my parents paid her rent, and every time, her mistakes were neatly labeled a rough patch to excuse them. My parents looked at her with eyes brimming with pride, as if Sophie had just announced some remarkable achievement. My father quickly popped the champagne, the sharp crack drowning out my racing heartbeat, and poured it into the glittering crystal glasses. "Here's to a new beginning," he said, his voice bright, as though he were witnessing a grand milestone in our family. My mother tilted her head towards Sophie, resting her hand tenderly on her youngest daughter's arm, her eyes shining with absolute faith. Together they raised their glasses, clinking them solemnly, as if sealing some sacred ritual. I sat there, clutching my glass of water, my knuckles white from the pressure. I heard the champagne fizz into glasses, heard my sister's light laughter, and heard most clearly of all my own silence. To everyone else, this was natural, a plan already prepared and simply announced. No one turned to look at me, no one considered whether I wanted this or not. In that moment, I felt erased from my own story. The house I had seen as the greatest accomplishment of my life had suddenly been turned into a reward they were ready to hand to Sophie, while my protest, if I dared voice it, seemed nothing more than an inconvenient footnote in a family script written long ago. I sat there, trying to keep my breathing steady, but inside my chest my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might tear itself apart. Sophie's casual words still echoed in my ears, and the radiant smile on her face made me want to both leap up and laugh bitterly at her brazenness. I gripped the glass of water so tightly that my hand went rigid, my knuckles bleaching white. I knew that if I let myself slip even a little, the anger would erupt in front of everyone. But for years I had learned how to press it down, how to hide my fury behind silence, just to avoid being called selfish or difficult. And this time, I did the same. I stayed quiet, but in my mind a reel of familiar images played, twisting my stomach into knots. Just a few days earlier, while cleaning the garage, I had found several large plastic bins stacked neatly against the wall. Dust clung to their lids, but the bold black marker letters left no room for doubt: Sophie's clothes, Sophie's books. I froze, caught between confusion and unease. I remember texting Sophie immediately, half joking, half skeptical, "Why are you moving your whole closet into my house?" Her reply came back quickly, curt and cold: "Just temporary, my apartment's too small." I nodded to myself then, convincing myself it was nothing, that she'd move them out soon. I wanted to believe it, because believing was easier than admitting a plan might already be unfolding without me in it. And now, with Sophie's breezy announcement at the dinner table, all the pieces snapped together with cruel clarity. Those boxes weren't just storage. The chilled champagne wasn't for some random occasion. And my parents' adoring looks at Sophie weren't just about the youngest child. It was all scripted, all arranged. The only person left out of the plan was me, as if my house, my life, required no consent from me at all. I sat there, listening to Sophie's giggles, the sharp clinking of champagne glasses, and I knew with absolute certainty, this was no longer a family dinner. This was a staged performance, and I was the supporting character forced to nod along. I kept my face calm, but inside me a bitter ache swelled, sharper than any anger. Because even before this dinner, I had already stumbled onto the darker corner of the truth. Scrolling online one evening, I had come across a shared Pinterest board between my mother and Aunt Sarah. The title alone made my skin prickle: Sophie's New Room. I clicked, curious, and the images told the rest of the story. Paint swatches in soft pastel blue for a soothing feel. A queen-sized bed under a sunny window. White bookshelves lined neatly. A fluffy rug sprawled across the floor. Even a cozy little workspace with a wooden desk and a reading lamp. The captions were telling: perfect for Sophie and cozy corner for her new start. I stared at the screen, numb, because the room they were so excited to design wasn't somewhere else, it was the spare bedroom in my house. The house I had spent 9 years scraping, sacrificing, and grinding for, was being reimagined as an interior design project for a sister who had never once shouldered responsibility. My mind filled with memories of all the times Sophie stumbled and was instantly rescued. I remembered when she was evicted from her downtown Dallas apartment after 3 months of unpaid rent. I thought it would finally be a hard lesson, but within days my parents had written a check to move her somewhere else. The second time, it was the same, Sophie crying over the phone, and that very night the debt was paid off. On and on it went, every failure met not with consequences, but with another bailout. And every time I dared to protest, the reply was the same, as if recited from scripture: family helps family. I'd heard it so many times it became a refrain etched into me, but never once had I seen it applied to me. I thought of the nights I sat alone in my cold kitchen, surrounded by stacks of repair bills, roof replacement, plumbing, heating, calculating and recalculating how not to sink into the red. No one knew how many vacations I canceled, how many dinners with friends I missed, how many tears I swallowed while typing up another freelance job just to scrape by. I never asked anyone to carry my burdens. But at the very least, I never expected to be turned into the default resource for someone else. And the cruelest truth of all was that in my parents' eyes, none of those sacrifices had ever been enough to make me worthy of protection. Sophie was always the center of their help, while I was forever labeled the strong one, the eldest daughter who supposedly needed nothing at all. Looking at that Pinterest board, I felt as though I had been erased from the family portrait from the very beginning. They discussed, they imagined, they designed every little detail of Sophie's new life inside my house, without once thinking it necessary to ask the person who actually owned it. I realized this truth hadn't begun with tonight's dinner, it had been brewing for a long time. I had simply grown too accustomed to being sidelined to notice just how thoroughly I had been pushed out. I sat there, glancing around the table, and the weight I had carried for years rose so sharply that it almost stole my breath. In my parents' eyes, I had never been a person with my own limits and needs. I was a support beam, the default resource for Sophie to lean on whenever she stumbled. For years, the script never changed. Sophie overspent, Sophie lost her job, Sophie chose the wrong person, and then the whole family would turn to me, as if I had been born to clean up after her. If I agreed, they smiled in satisfaction. If I hesitated, I instantly became cold, selfish, unfeeling. I had grown used to those labels, to the disappointed looks, to the sighs that weren't sympathy but reminders that I owed it to everyone to carry the weight. But sitting here, hearing Sophie declare she'd be moving into my house as if it were a given, I saw it more clearly than ever. In this family, I had never been recognized as someone with the right to refuse. I was a temporary prop for my sister's repeated failures, a wallet my parents could open whenever they deemed it necessary. And the most painful part was that they truly believed this was natural, that my duty was to sacrifice myself so Sophie would never have to face the world head-on. The realization pressed against my chest, a mix of rage and hollowness. I understood that if I didn't stop it now, I would forever be seen as a bottomless resource, never acknowledged, never valued. And the cruelest truth of all, I had let them believe it for far too long. I stayed silent for a long moment, letting the clinking glasses and cheerful chatter drift past me as if they couldn't touch me. Then slowly, I bent down beside my chair, my fingers sliding into my bag until they found the smooth surface of a yellow envelope. It was something I had planned to leave in the car, thinking the time wasn't right. But the moment Sophie casually claimed the right to move into my house, I knew there would never be a right time. I pulled the envelope out and set it down firmly on the table. The dry thud echoed through the chandelier-lit room, cutting off every laugh, every clink of glass, every scrape of a chair. I lifted my head and looked at each familiar face. My father froze, his hand still clutching his glass, champagne foam sliding down his fingers unnoticed. My mother stiffened mid-laugh, her bright smile collapsing into wary suspicion. Sophie blinked rapidly, her surprise flickering into confusion, then disbelief. I took a deep breath, and when I spoke my voice rang out clear, deliberate, cold enough that even I felt the distance in it. I've sold the house. I have 30 days to move out. The words fell like a blade across the celebration. The room, moments ago full of cheer, thickened into silence. I heard the faint clink of a spoon slipping into a plate, Sophie's sharp intake of breath, the heavy tick of the wall clock. My father's face twisted, as if the sounds coming from my mouth made no sense. My mother swallowed hard, lips trembling open then snapping shut again, unable to form words. And Sophie, her eyes widened, her hands slackened, and champagne spilled onto the polished wood floor, glistening like an open wound. I sat straighter, not flinching, not explaining, not apologizing. My whole life I had learned to bow to everyone else's desires. But in that moment, I felt a different kind of weight, heavy, but no longer a burden. It was the weight of truth finally laid down in the open. I didn't need their approval, and I wasn't afraid of their judgment. That house had been my dream, and if the choice was between letting it be treated as family property for plans I was never asked about, or giving it up to reclaim control of my life, then the decision had already been made. And they had just heard it, with no turning back. The sharp crash of breaking glass tore through the silence. Crystal shards scattered across the floor, catching the chandelier's glow like tiny, jagged wounds. Champagne seeped into the carpet, curling into messy trails, filling the air with its acrid sting that overpowered even the smell of roast chicken still steaming on the table. Sophie stood frozen, her hands shaking, eyes wide with panic. Her mouth opened, but only fractured gasps came out. I had never seen her like this, stripped of her easy confidence, her habitual laugh. All that was left was raw fear, the terror of a script she had counted on suddenly unraveling before her eyes. My mother was the first to spring up, her chair screeching against the wooden floor with a piercing scrape. Her face flushed crimson, her hands trembling, but her eyes sharp as blades. "You don't know what you're doing, Claire," she hissed, her voice breaking with rage. "Every real estate transaction has a cancellation period. Tomorrow I'll call the lawyer. We're going to stop this madness right away." She leaned toward me, her voice lowering but heavy with threat, as if I were a stubborn child about to be punished. My father slammed his hand down on the table, his wine glass rattling violently, liquid sloshing over the rim. "Have you forgotten? Who helps you pay your property taxes every year? If you're foolish enough to pull this stunt, don't ever expect another dime from me." He spoke as though I should cower before the threat, as though my entire life had been built on his help, and withdrawing it would bring me to my knees. In truth, that money was a minor contribution, but he had always wielded it like proof of power, a leash to keep me obedient. I looked at them all, their fury flooding the room, Sophie lowering her head, tears starting to fall, and I realized, all three of them were waiting for me to break. They were used to my silence, my swallowing everything until I finally nodded. But this time, there was nothing left for me to give. I set both hands on the table, sat up straight, and let my voice ring out, not trembling at all, so calm it even startled me. "I sold the house for myself. This isn't a compromise anymore." I saw my parents falter, not because they were convinced, but because the firmness in my tone unsettled them. My mother opened her mouth, then clamped it shut, her eyes flashing with a helplessness she wouldn't admit. My father gripped his glass tighter, blue veins standing out on the back of his hand. And Sophie, for the first time, she didn't argue, didn't scream. She just sat there, tears sliding down her cheeks. And in that moment, I knew the boundary had been set. There was no going back, no more silent endurance. That house, my dream, might be leaving my hands, but the right to steer my own life had finally returned to me. The news spread faster than I imagined. In just one night, the story had twisted completely. Sophie posted a long entry on Facebook, opening with an old photo of the two of us as little girls, in matching school uniforms, holding hands and smiling in front of our childhood home. Beneath it, she wrote, "The most painful part isn't losing a house, but realizing your own sister would sell the family home just to throw you out on the street. Family should be forever, not just when it's convenient." The words were crafted artfully, dripping with sorrow, striking directly at anyone's sympathy. And it worked, suffocatingly so. Dozens of comments poured in, digital hugs, words of comfort. "Poor Sophie, don't worry, your family is always here for you." And there, nestled among them, was my mother's name, her short comment cutting like a knife, "Don't be afraid, you'll always have us." I nearly hurled my phone onto the table when I read it. Not because I wasn't used to being misunderstood, I had carried the labels selfish, difficult, cold eldest daughter all my life. But this was different. Sophie had cast me as the villain in public, before the whole extended family, friends, even colleagues, with a story that was utterly false. She hadn't just twisted the facts, she had pulled everyone into her corner, leaving me condemned before a crowd. The phone rang incessantly. Aunt Sarah called first, her voice quivering. "Claire, how could you do this? Sophie is suffering, and do you really have no compassion?" Before I could hang up, Uncle Robert's voice thundered down the line, "Your parents sacrificed their whole lives for you kids, and now it's your turn, and you choose to throw your sister onto the street? Shameful, Claire." Even Chuck, my father's golf buddy, who had never once been involved in any family matter, texted to tell me to think carefully before losing all respect. I thought the fallout would stay within the family, but the next morning proved me wrong. As I stepped into the office, I realized I was surrounded. While pouring myself coffee, I heard footsteps approach. Lisa, a coworker from my floor, lowered her voice as if sharing a scandal. "Claire, I saw Sophie at Starbucks this morning. She said you sold the house just to leave her homeless. My church runs a shelter program. If you need help finding her a place to stay, let me know." The strained smile on her face hit me like a slap. At that moment, my hand shook so badly that coffee spilled over the rim, dripping onto the counter. I stood there frozen, not knowing whether to laugh or to cry. Since when did a 32-year-old woman, still holding the keys to her rented apartment, still with parents who owned a sprawling 4-bedroom house, suddenly become a homeless victim in the eyes of society? And since when did I, the one who fought for every dollar to keep my house from collapsing, who endured countless sleepless nights under the weight of stacked bills, become painted as cruel, heartless, and cold-blooded enough to sell my house just to throw my sister out? I stood there, clutching the paper coffee cup in my hand, feeling both numb and furious, my throat tightening until I could barely swallow. So this was all it took, a single post with a few sorrowful lines, and everything I had sacrificed, all the truths I had silently carried for years, could be buried overnight. And I knew, from this moment forward, I was no longer just up against Sophie and my parents, but against an entire court of public opinion eager to condemn me without hearing a single word of explanation. I stopped answering calls, stopped replying to messages. The more accusations I heard, the clearer it became that any explanation I gave would only be twisted further. The anger burned inside my chest like a fire, desperate to erupt, but I forced myself into silence. I knew how it worked in this family. Every time I reacted emotionally, they branded me as difficult, selfish, unstable. So this time I chose another path, let silence be my weapon, while I gathered every piece of proof of what I had endured. That evening I sat alone in my living room, the table covered with piles of invoices and bank statements. I arranged them carefully in chronological order, each expense weighing heavily on me, the $11,200 bill for replacing the roof after last year's storm, nearly wiping out an entire year's worth of savings. Then the $8,200 receipt for replacing the main water line when the city inspection revealed it had rotted through, leaving no option but full replacement. And finally, the $5,000 bill for a new heating system, right as winter set in, when the house had already grown unbearably cold. I looked at those numbers, and I saw again every sleepless night, every drop of sweat, every hidden tear I had forced down. I stacked them all into a thick folder, labeled neatly. Not to beg for sympathy, not to plead for understanding, but to remind myself that I wasn't making anything up, that none of this was out of malice. I had lived through this. I had paid for that house with my own blood and bone, and selling it wasn't about throwing Sophie out, it was about saving myself from drowning in debt. In silence, it was clear, when the truth is distorted, the only thing that can protect me isn't words, but the numbers that cannot be denied. That night my living room felt like a courtroom. I opened the door, and each familiar face walked in with the same expression, curious, judgmental. My parents first, their faces grave. Sophie close behind, her eyes red as though she'd rehearsed her role as victim. Aunt Sarah with her arm hooked through Uncle Robert's, 2 other relatives dragging out chairs as though ready to hear the verdict. They gathered around the long wooden dining table, the overhead light glinting off the neat stacks of documents I had laid out, lined up like evidence in a trial no one wanted to face. I sat at the head of the table, spine straight, both hands resting on the folder. The room was hushed, only the creak of chairs and the heavy sound of breathing. I pulled the first paper from the stack, smoothing it flat in the center of the table. "This is the roof replacement invoice," I said, my voice steady, not loud, but each word weighed down like lead. $11,200. I had to drain every cent of my savings to pay it, and after that, my emergency fund was completely empty. No one answered, only the faint rustle of paper as I drew out the second bill. "This is $8,200 to replace the entire main water line. The city gave me no choice. Either replace it, or live with the risk of flooding at any moment." I laid it down, sliding it to the center so everyone could see. The air in the room grew heavier. Sophie pressed her lips together, refusing to meet the numbers printed in stark black. I held the third bill a moment longer before placing it down with a soft thud. $5,000 for a new heating system, right at the start of winter. I had no other choice, otherwise I would have been sitting in freezing cold. My voice caught for just a second, not from weakness, but from the memory of those long nights, hunched over stacks of bills with a cup of cold coffee, calculating and recalculating every cent, just to keep from sinking. The 3 sheets lay side by side, the numbers printed in stark black under the light, undeniable evidence. I lifted my gaze, meeting each face that tried to look away. My father shifted slightly, his brow furrowed but his mouth clamped shut. My mother wet her lips, her eyes flashing with both anger and unease. Sophie kept her head down, her hands twisted tightly together. I drew in a deep breath, and when I spoke, my voice was steady but firm. This is the truth. I didn't sell the house to hurt Sophie. I sold it because I had no other choice. I am exhausted, financially, mentally. And these numbers are the only proof you cannot twist. The words fell heavy, like a verdict. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock, each beat reminding them that the old family game of blame had slammed into a new wall, a wall called truth. And this time, I wasn't stepping aside. The silence after I spread those bills was so thick that I could hear the second hand dragging across the clock. My parents' faces stayed stiff, their eyes flicking towards Sophie as though waiting for her to cry so they could pin it on me again. Sophie's head was still bowed, her fingers clenched together, her shoulders trembling, whether in anger or shame, I couldn't tell. I braced myself for the familiar phrases, family helps family, you're the older sister, you have to sacrifice, when suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. Claire isn't wrong, Uncle William said, his voice deep, slow, but unyielding. He set his hand down on the table, his eyes locking on my father. I've been watching this for years. Everyone here knows Sophie has been rescued time after time, while Claire has carried everything alone. This favoritism stopped being love a long time ago. It's indulgence. His words landed like a hammer, making the room tremble. My mother froze, the forced smile slipping off her face, while my father scowled, unable to find a retort. Dorothy, my mother's longtime friend, usually silent in these family dramas, straightened her back, her eyes lit with a rare steel. I've known this family for more than 20 years, she said, her voice steady and firm. I watched Claire buy that house on her own, no one helped her. And Sophie, year after year, rent covered, credit card debts, even car payments. I don't want to intrude, but the truth is plain to anyone looking in. Only those closest pretend not to see. Barbara, my financial advisor, adjusted the folder in front of her, her voice calm but piercing, each word like a needle into the silence. I can tell you with certainty, continuing to bail Sophie out is damaging both sides. The payer is drained dry, and the receiver never learns to stand on her own 2 feet. That isn't helping. It's keeping a child from ever growing up. Each word struck like a blade against the truth my family had long refused to face. I saw Sophie's cheeks blaze, her eyes burning with rage. She slammed her hand down on the table, her voice cracking theatrically. So you're all ganging up on me now? You all think I'm nothing but a burden? Claire is always the perfect sister, and I'm just the failure in everyone's eyes, right? Hot tears streamed down her face, but this time no sighs of pity rose, no arms reached to shield her. Sophie shot to her feet, her chair screeching and crashing against the floor, then bolted for the door. Her footsteps pounded, then the door slammed shut, rattling the frame. I sat frozen, waiting for someone to rise, to chase after her, to soothe her like always. But the room stayed still. My parents didn't move. Aunt Sarah kept her eyes down, staring at the table. Uncle Robert adjusted his glasses, avoiding every gaze. Not one person spoke. Not one person followed. In that moment, it was as if a heavy fog had finally lifted. The wall of favoritism that had shielded Sophie all these years crumbled, and for the first time, no one saw her as the helpless victim in need of saving. The room, which had always been the place where I was cast aside, had become the place where the truth finally stood on my side. The silence after the door slammed shut was deafening. Its echo ricocheted off the walls before fading, leaving a hollow stillness so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. I sat quietly, looking toward my parents, waiting for them to speak as they always had, either to blame me, or to mourn for Sophie. But nothing came. For the first time, they said nothing at all. My mother lowered her gaze, her finger tapping lightly against the rim of her glass, a nervous habit she used to mask her unease. Her shoulders trembled faintly, whether from swallowed anger or the shame of undeniable evidence, I couldn't tell. My father, the man who usually roared whenever I dared to challenge him, now just sat there, his hand clenched hard on his knee, his eyes unfocused on the wood grain of the table as if the numbers $11, $200, $8,200, $5,000 were etched into it, impossible to erase. They were still breathing, still present, but their silence weighed heavier than any outburst could. For the first time, I saw the familiar spark of resistance fade from their eyes, replaced instead with a hollow acknowledgement. They didn't praise me, didn't apologize, but the simple act of lowering their heads, unable to refute, was already a change I had never witnessed before. I sat upright, feeling both pain and relief. Pain, because I knew it had taken cornering them with facts to make them fall silent. Relief, because finally I no longer had to scream just to prove I wasn't insane, selfish, or cruel. The truth had spoken for me. And in that quiet bow of their heads, I knew the balance in this family had begun to shift. A few days later, just as I sealed a box of books for the move, the doorbell rang. Through the window I saw a familiar sight, my father's Buick parked in the driveway, and behind him, Sophie standing close to my mother. They hadn't called ahead, but they didn't need to. The way the three of them stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch said enough. They had come with a new plan. I opened the door and let them into a living room now half bare, cartons stacked high against the walls. My mother sank onto the sofa, clutching her handbag on her lap, her hands intertwined like she was bracing for a negotiation. My father offered a strained smile, trying for warmth but betraying the tension beneath. Sophie lingered in the background, her eyes wet but missing the defiant glint I'd grown used to. "Claire," my mother began, her voice sweet but strained, "we've thought this over. We understand you need to sell the house to ease your burden, but Sophie still needs somewhere to live. We were hoping you might give her some money, just enough to rent a place, at least for the first few months." My father nodded quickly, adding in his low voice, "It would only be a small amount. You can afford it, it wouldn't affect you much." I sat still for a few seconds, hearing every word, and the familiarity of it all rose inside me, requests coated in sugar, but orders at their core. I set my teacup down, met their eyes, and said evenly, firmly, "I will not give Sophie money." I saw my mother flinch, my father's brow knit as he ready to protest, and Sophie leaned slightly forward as though on the verge of tears. But before they could speak, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a business card. I placed it on the table and slid it toward my sister. "My company is hiring an administrative assistant. The starting salary is enough for a one-bedroom apartment. I've already spoken with HR, and they agreed to interview Sophie if she's interested. This isn't money, it's an opportunity. Whether she takes it is her choice." The room fell silent. Sophie's eyes flickered, fixed on the card like it was an alien object. My parents sat motionless, and for the first time, they didn't leap to argue. In that pause, I knew this negotiation would not end with my concession. I let the silence linger, letting them taste what I had endured my entire life, sitting there, pressed, unheard, expected only to nod. But this time, I did not nod. I stood, walked slowly into my small office, and returned with a thick folder I had prepared. I laid it on the table beside the untouched business card. "This," I said, my voice low but resolute, "is the total amount you've given Sophie over the past 5 years." I flipped the first page, the figures stark and undeniable. 7 months' rent, $12,300. Credit card debts paid off, $8,000. Car purchase assistance, $15,000. Countless smaller bailouts for living expenses, half-finished courses, in total, nearly $50,000. I slid the folder toward my parents, my eyes locked on theirs. "This isn't love. This is dependency. And love, when twisted into unconditional cover, doesn't save anyone. It only chains everyone tighter." My voice was steady, unshaking, but inside, my heart pounded as though every word had to fight through the walls built from years of silence. Sophie shot up from her chair as if a fire had been lit beneath her. The screech of wood dragging harshly across the floor sent a chill through the room. Her face flushed red, her eyes blazing, her lips trembling. "You always keep score. Always make me feel worthless. You think you're so perfect, Claire? Have you ever failed? Ever tasted real despair? You're always the golden daughter, and me? I'll never be enough in anyone's eyes." Her voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks, whether for raw truth or just her familiar habit of pleading, I couldn't tell. My parents stirred, ready to speak, but then fell silent. No one rushed to pull her back, no one stepped in to defend. The room was filled with Sophie's sobs, but layered over it was a strange, unfamiliar quiet that no longer bent in her favor. She clutched her bag, spun on her heel, and stormed toward the door, her steps sharp, as if trying to sever everything in her path. The door slammed, rattling the frame. My parents quickly followed, their footsteps heavy, but in that burst of chaos I caught something small, Sophie's hand darting across the table, snatching the business card I had left. The movement was quick, discreet, almost like even she didn't want it seen. When the door closed, it left me alone in the empty room, the echo reverberating through my chest like a final punctuation. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted yet strangely lighter. She could rage, accuse, deny every word I said, but that furtive grab for the card told me one thing: beneath all the fury, Sophie knew no one was coming to save her anymore. If she wanted her place in the world, she would have to step into it herself. And maybe, for the first time in years, that could actually happen. I left the old house on a chilly morning, the moving truck pulling away and leaving behind a yard so bare it stabbed at me to look at. But only weeks later, standing inside my new townhouse, I knew I had made the right choice. It was smaller, 2 floors, modest rooms, a backyard barely big enough for a table and a few potted plants. No wide garden for rose bushes like I had once dreamed. Yet every time I opened my banking app and saw my living expenses down nearly 40%, it felt like a boulder had been lifted from my chest. After years of living clenched, calculating every penny, I finally knew what financial safety felt like. For the first time, I wasn't afraid that a single call from a repairman could drown me in debt. At night, I sat in the little kitchen, warm and unpretentious, listening to the steady tick of the clock, and felt a quiet I had never known. No more endless spreadsheets, no more nights awake until 2 or 3 in the morning patching holes in a budget. I could breathe, not with the shaky breath of survival, but a deep exhale that touched peace. Among the unopened boxes, I had placed one gift on the simple wooden table, a brand new camera, its metal casing gleaming. Something I once thought would forever stay on the if I ever had the money list. For 9 years, photography had been nothing more than quick phone snapshots, fleeting fragments of what I didn't dare invest in. I always told myself, wait until things are stable. Wait until there's extra. But stability had never come until I cut away the weight myself. I enrolled in a night photography class at the community center nearby. Just imagining myself standing in daylight, camera in hand, learning to capture small, beautiful details made my heart race like I was young again. It wasn't a luxury anymore, it was a piece of me I had abandoned for years, now reclaimed. In that modest townhouse, I saw something the bigger house had never given me: the right to dream, to create something for myself, and most of all, the right to live as who I truly was. As time passed, things began to shift in ways I never thought possible. Sophie started working at a small media company. The job wasn't glamorous, the pay wasn't high, but it was enough to cover her rent for a 1-bedroom, enough to buy her groceries, pay her utilities, and take responsibility for her own life. I saw her tired, the dark circles under her eyes from long hours, but it was a different kind of tired, the kind that comes with standing on your own. Sometimes when we met, she would brag about budgeting, her tone still a little too cheerful, but within it was a seriousness I had never seen in her before. My parents began to change too. At family dinners, they no longer centered every glance, every dish, every ounce of favor on Sophie. I no longer had to sit there and watch the best portions be placed at her side while I received only shallow, polite questions. Instead, they started dividing their attention. My mother sometimes asked about my photography class, while my father sat quietly, listening as I talked about a project at work. Small questions, yes, but I felt the difference. They were beginning to see me as a person with my own world, not just a pillar by default meant to carry everyone else. I remember bringing a few photos I had taken, and my father stared at them for a long time, nodding before he murmured, "You've got a good eye for detail." Just a simple sentence, but in that moment, my chest softened, because it was the first time in years he spoke about me without comparison, without hidden reproach. My mother sat in silence, but her hand pressed mine in a brief, awkward squeeze. It was clumsy, hesitant, but I knew it was her way of apologizing, something she had never known how to say out loud. One late afternoon in the townhouse, I sat alone as the last light of day slanted through the window and spilled across the white walls. On the table sat my camera, carefully placed, a reminder that I was finally living for myself. I looked around the tidy, modest room, nothing extravagant, but warm, and realized something with clarity. I no longer felt indebted to family ties. I no longer had to prove my worth by sacrificing for others. And I no longer trembled under their judgment, because now I understood, true love never comes with conditions or invisible chains. I drew in a deep breath and, for the first time, felt freedom not as some distant luxury but as a state alive in every breath, every step I took. And in the quiet of my new home, I smiled, not to reassure anyone, not to project strength, but simply for me. I sat in that small townhouse, the last light of the day glowing through the window, everything so still I could hear my heart beat. In that moment, I knew what I had traded. I had lost a house built with my sweat, my tears, and the best years of my youth. But in return, I had won back my life. A life no longer bound by endless expectations, no longer treated as a resource on demand, but a life I could steer, where I could choose how to live, where to go, and how to love myself. And you, what about you? If one day you had to choose between silence to keep your family happy, or courage to draw the line to protect yourself, what would you choose? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to Family Ashes, hit like, and share this video so others too can find the strength to say, enough.